Here we go. Listen up. The overall topic on this is this. The presidency of John F. Kennedy, Part 1. There are going to be several parts. If I lectured over the entire presidency of President Kennedy, we would be here till Christmas talking about one test. So we break it up for you. So this is Part 1. And the first subtopic under this is the administration of President Kennedy. Now it's kind of, we don't really do this anymore, but in that time in history, every president named their administration. Anybody know what Franklin Roosevelt called his administration from your history last year?
Something about
Huh?
what?
Something about what?
I don't know.
What are we eating today, Glenn?
That's Pop-Tart.
Yeah, let's get rid of that, shall we?
Mm-hmm.
You got anything left? There goes. Okay.
No.
Anybody know what Franklin Roosevelt called his administration? Boy, if you don't know this, I'm worried about you.
The New Deal.
The New Deal. Thank you. Does anybody know what President Truman called his administration after that? Close. The Fair Deal. Okay. What did Eisenhower call his administration that actually Ronald Reagan named his? The first time a president had named an administration in some time. Anybody know what that one is? That'd be a little tougher. He said modern republicanism was the name of his administration. The name of Kennedy's administration was the New Frontier. It was called the New Frontier. And President Kennedy had 4 objectives for his administration, things he wanted to accomplish in the New Frontier. Okay? So, the Kennedy administration became known in American history as the New Frontier, and President Kennedy had 4 objectives that he wanted to accomplish during his administration. The first was to build up the military with conventional weapons. He wanted to build up the military with conventional weapons. Ms. Klingler, what is a conventional weapon? Think of me and my technology skills. What is a conventional weapon in a world that has lots of different things now? What do you think of a conventional weapon is? What was the big issue at this time in history? Non-nuclear. Very good. So he wanted to build up the military with conventional or non-nuclear weapons. Tanks, machine guns, battleships, etc. So he wanted to build up the military with conventional or non-nuclear weapons. He is going to try to avoid nuclear holocaust. He is not for the buildup of nuclear weapons. And so he's going to build up the military with conventional and then go to the negotiation table with communist countries and see if he can get them to do the same, which turned out to be a thing called the Test Ban Treaty, which we'll talk about later. The second objective that Kennedy had for the New Frontiers, he wanted to pass the Russians in the race for space. We'll talk about that in detail. He wanted to pass the Russians in the race for space. 2 other things he did, he kind of hammered Nixon in the debates on. What else do you think he wanted to do in his administration? What? Go ahead. Very good. He wanted to provide government money for education. Very good. And what was the 4th thing that he talked about that he criticized Nixon? Thank you very much. Provide medical care for the elderly. So the 4 objectives that Kennedy had for his administration, known as the New Frontier, was 1, to build up the military with conventional or non-nuclear weapons. Number 2, to pass the Russians in the race for space. Number 3, provide government money for education. No one had done that before. And 4, provide medical care for the elderly. No one had done that before. Okay? I'll tell you the Gramadur story when we get to that point. It's an incredible story, but it has right to do with that particular providing medical care for the elderly. So that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is the presidential cabinet of John F. Kennedy. These are very important names that are going to come up throughout his administration and are going to really make a difference in our discussions. Okay? Now, a presidential cabinet, I assume we all know what that is. Those are people that the president puts in certain positions to aid him in being a president of the United States. Now, one thing Kennedy did that was a little bit different than Eisenhower and Truman is he brought in a variety of people into his cabinet. He just didn't go with all Democrats down party lines. He brought a variety of people in, politically and otherwise. Now I'm going to tell you who these people are, and you'll need to make sure you know who they are, because they'll stick with us for a while. First of all, you've heard of this one. The first member of his cabinet worth mentioning was the vice president, which was Lyndon B Johnson. Okay? So the first person in his cabinet, not first, but very important part, although he wasn't, was Lyndon B Johnson. What do you know about Lyndon B Johnson that I've told you so far? Senator from Texas. Also, I said it, but I didn't emphasize it. He was the Senate Majority Leader. He was the head of the Senate. And actually, when he went into the vice presidency, he lost what? Power. He had way more power as Senate Majority Leader than he did as vice president. Some people think that the vice presidency might be the closest thing to falling off the face of the earth, because you are kind of like the assistant coach, and unless the head coach uses you a ton, you end up kind of just being sent to scout here or sent to do this. Okay? He also was a very powerful politician from Texas. He was very well respected in the South. One of the reasons why Kennedy put him on the ticket, because he wanted the Southern vote. So he was very popular in the South, especially Texas. So there's your vice president. Next important position is Secretary of State. What does the Secretary of State do, first of all, for the president? Anybody know that? Helps him deal with matters foreign or domestic, mainly. Foreign, okay? And the man he chose is this fellow right up here in this Time magazine. His name is Dean Rusk. Smallest signature I've ever seen. But anyway, Dean Rusk, that fellow kind of right there with the receding hairline, that's Dean Rusk. That's who Kennedy appointed as his Secretary of State. Now, telling you a little bit about Dean Rusk, he was a very quiet, calm man. He was a Republican from Georgia. Not a Democrat, a Republican from Georgia. Had a very calm and quiet demeanor about him. And obviously he had a job before he became a part of Kennedy's cabinet, right? He was actually the president of the Rockefeller Foundation. President of the Rockefeller Foundation. So he was a calm, quiet Republican from Georgia, who at the time of his appointment was president of the Rockefeller Foundation. Anybody want to venture to guess what the Rockefeller Foundation is, that was and still is today? Goes along with the Rockefeller family, who have what? A lot of money. So it's a foundation. Charitable organization that does things for certain. And Dean Rusk was the president. He ran the Rockefeller family's foundation, charity foundation. So he's pretty Republican, wouldn't you say? Okay. Secretary of Defense helps the president manage military matters, so to speak. And he chose a fellow right here. Kind of hard to see, but you can look after class. Robert S Mcnamara. And if you look at that picture, he's the kind of guy on the right with his hand on his forehead. Robert S Mcnamara. Now, he was a Democrat from California. And I think you might be surprised what his job title was before he became Secretary of Defense.
He was a Democrat from California?
Democrat from California, yep. You know what his job was? He was the president of Ford Motor Company prior to his appointment as Secretary of Defense. He was the president of Ford Motor Company. He will have a long, tedious job and will serve into the Johnson administration and be heavily involved in that conflict we know in Southeast Asia as Vietnam. Okay? So, Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, Kennedy's appointment. The Secretary of Treasury, fellow right here. Again, you can come up and look at these. Right here, this fellow right here, C. Douglas Dillon was the Secretary of the Treasury. C. Douglas Dillon. C. Douglas Dillon, Secretary of the Treasury. What's the C? No, I really don't know that.
Maybe it's a really terrible name.
Now, he was a Republican and a very wealthy New York investment banker. at his time of appointment. Okay? He was a Republican and a very wealthy New York investment banker. Secretary of the Treasury C. Douglas Dillon, a Republican and wealthy New York investment banker. Let you know how much money he had. He once personally donated $20 million to the New York Metropolitan Museum. That's how much money that guy had. At one time he donated $20 million. So he was a Republican and wealthy New York investment banker who one time donated $20 million to the New York Metropolitan Museum. Yeah.
So Secretary of Treasury is just...
Helps the president manage finances in the country. Yeah. He donated to the New York Metropolitan Museum. New York Met Museum. Yeah, you guys baseball fans? You know, wonder where the 20 million. Anybody, you know, New York Mets, you know what that stands for? New York Metropolitans. That's what it stands for, believe it or not. Okay. Another important cabinet position is the press secretary. That's the person that puts out press releases and speaks on behalf of the president and his administration when they don't speak out for themselves. Okay, they deal with the press. And the man that was chosen to do that was a fellow by the name of Pierre Salinger. Pierre Salinger. And I got it right here. Pierre Salinger, right here. Now this is an interesting photo. This is an old, one of those old Polaroids from the 1960s that Salinger signed. But Pierre Salinger became the press secretary for President Kennedy. Pierre Salinger. Now you're going to start to see in his cabinet, he's going to start now filling it with what? Associates and friends and Democrats. Pierre Salinger, prior to being press secretary, was associate friend of the Kennedy family. He helped with John Kennedy's Senate and presidential campaigns, and in the future will be the campaign manager for Robert Kennedy when he runs for president in 1968. So he's a very close friend of the Kennedys, close associate. He worked in both John Kennedy's senatorial and presidential campaign. Who was the manager of that campaign, by the way? Bobby Kennedy. And Pierre Salinger turned out to be the campaign manager for Bobby Kennedy's run for the presidency in '68 before he was assassinated. So Pierre Salinger becomes press secretary. Now, the National Security Advisor. What's the National Security Advisor do? Advises the president on security matters, things that would be a security risk to the country. Now, this fella is right up here. His name was McGeorge Bundy. I'm going to tell you something. That was the hardest signature I ever obtained. You cannot find him, and I paid a lot of money for that. But McGeorge Bundy was the National Security Advisor under President Kennedy. McGeorge Bundy. I'll repeat it several times. The National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy. Now again, he was a Kennedy loyalist. What do I mean by a Kennedy loyalist? Friend of the Kennedy family. Yep, obviously a Democrat. And he was a former professor and the former dean of students at Harvard University before becoming National Security Advisor. So Kennedy's National Security Advisor was McGeorge Bundy. He was a Kennedy loyalist, former professor, and former dean of students at Harvard University. Pretty bright fellow. Pretty bright fellow. What else are you going to need in your cabinet besides a press secretary? And he's used this guy in his campaigns for every office he's run for. Need somebody who can do what? Write you a good speech. Everybody has a speechwriter. The speechwriter for President Kennedy was Theodore Sorensen. Theodore Sorensen. And I don't have a picture of Theodore Sorensen up here, but I do have his signature on this first edition stamp here. Theodore Sorensen. He looked a lot like McGeorge Bundy, actually. But Theodore Sorensen was Kennedy's speechwriter. He had been in the inner circle as an advisor to Kennedy for years and years. He was an assistant of Kennedy's during Kennedy's senatorial years. He served as the president's speechwriter all the way through the election of 1960. All the speeches he gave when campaigning for the presidency were the works of Theodore Sorensen. What do you think his position was, besides being, obviously he was a writer, what do you think his professional position was if he's a speechwriter? You need to know what was right and wrong. What do you think he is? Close. Kind of. He's a lawyer. Okay? So Theodore Sorensen was a lawyer. He was a writer. He served in the inner circle to the Kennedys forever. He was an assistant when Kennedy was senator of Massachusetts. He was an assistant to the senator, and he served as the speechwriter and a strategist during the time that Kennedy ran for president. So he was in the mix from the start. Very good speechwriter. Some of the greatest speeches that Kennedy ever gave were a result of Theodore Sorensen's brain. Okay, he appointed John McCone as CIA director. And I'd like to tell you that I have a signature of John McCone. They are impossible. I cannot find one even offered. Didn't sign much. John McCone. Now I want to make a note on this guy because it's going to come up here. So the CIA director that was chosen by Kennedy was John McCone. He worked in the he worked in the Department of Defense under President Truman. And he actually wasn't the first person Kennedy had as CIA director. He inherited Allen W. Dulles from the Eisenhower administration, but he's going to fire Dulles quickly here and replace him with John McCone. Okay? So although the CIA director during most of the Kennedy administration was John McCone, it was Allen W. Dulles that Kennedy inherited from the Eisenhower administration, and I'll tell you why later, who later Kennedy fired and then replaced him with John McCone. But keep that Allen W. Dulles in mind, because he's going to come up in a few minutes here, maybe tomorrow, maybe today, and you'll get the reasoning behind that. So, CIA Director John McCone, he's a former deputy to the Secretary of Defense under President Truman. He replaced Allen W. Dulles when Dulles was fired during the Kennedy administration. So just know that he wasn't the first. Then what would a person maybe surround himself with in his cabinet that really didn't have a real fancy-dancy position? You might want to put some people loyal around. So Kennedy created some positions for people that were important to him, didn't look too important. Next person, Lawrence O'Brien, who had the job title as Special Assistant to the President. Here's a great picture and signature of Larry O'Brien, Lawrence O'Brien right here. And Kennedy brought him into his cabinet and gave him the title of Special Assistant to the President. His official job with Kennedy was he was to communicate with members of Congress for the President. So he got the job title of Special Assistant to the President, Lawrence O'Brien, and his job description was he was to communicate with members of both the House and the Senate, members of Congress for the President. He was the liaison between Congress and the President. But he leaned on Lawrence O'Brien for lots of things. Anybody want to guess what Lawrence O'Brien became after, you sports fans, what he became after he was a special assistant to President Kennedy? He became the commissioner of the NBA. Commissioner of the National Basketball Association for many, many years. So Lawrence O'Brien, special assistant to the president, job title to communicate with members of Congress, later went on to become commissioner of the National Basketball Association. The next two guys we'll talk about a lot. They were both given the title of special assistant to the president as well. One was David Powers, this fella right here. The other was Kenneth O'Donnell. And we'll talk about David Powers first, just so you know. This is a great piece there. Okay? I'll explain that to you. David Powers, special assistant to the president. His job was assistant appointments secretary. That was his job title. He was special assistant to the president, but his job description was he was the assistant appointments secretary for President Kennedy. So you would assist who in that position? The appointments secretary, which we'll get to. Because guess, probably what Kenneth O'Donnell's going to do. Okay? So, again, David Powers was a special assistant to the president. His job description, he was the assistant appointment secretary. Very, very close personal friend of the president. I have a cut signature of John Kennedy in my office. It says, cordially, Jack Kennedy. A cut signature, I think I've talked to you before, is something that's cut out of a letter because the people that own the letter don't want the contents out. That signature I received was a letter that John Kennedy wrote to David Powers. And Mrs. Powers didn't want the content, so she cut the signature and sold the signature without the contents. They are very close friends. He and Kenneth O'Donnell, which we'll talk about, co-authored a book entitled Johnny, We Hardly Knew Ye. Okay? Very famous book written by O'Donnell and Powers. This is a copy of the dust cover and signatures that were inside one of the books I have. Now, as some of you have found out, I don't know whether you like it or care, but I try to get every kid in here kind of a special book during the course of the year. And I've given some of you the Kennedy Wit. Some of you will get this book. Kind of interesting, I have to order these off of Amazon.com. And so they're usually not a lot of money if they're not out of print. There's a lot of those out there. I bought 28 last year, and that's what I gave the kids last year for Christmas, was a book, Johnny, We Hardly Knew Ye. And so I was ordering like crazy, and they were coming from several different arenas. And so I got them all in. I was all excited. I wrote a little note to all the kids for Christmas in the book, and I handed them out. And Shelby Reed looked at hers, and she was really appreciative of what I wrote her. And she looked on the next page when I didn't even look at the books, and she had a copy signed by David Powers that Amazon.com didn't even know they had. So she got quite a special treat. So they both wrote a book called co-authored Johnny, We Hardly Knew Ye.